members of council, members of the executive management, members of Senate, our inaugurant this afternoon, Professor Catherine Sutherland, family and friends of Professor Sutherland, academics and professional staff, students, alumni, and distinguished guests from universities and organizations within South Africa, the African continent, and across the globe. On behalf of the Vice Chancellor and Principal, Professor Nanapoku, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the inaugural lecture of Professor Catherine Sutherland. The Vice Chancellor conveys his congratulations and best wishes to Professor Catherine Sutherland. Inaugural lectures form part of the university's public lecture series and may only be presented by newly appointed full professors who have been appointed in academic schools and centers. Inaugural lectures present an opportunity for showcasing the exciting and groundbreaking research and teaching being carried out by our professors in our university. Each lecture represents a significant milestone in an academic's career, providing official recognition of their promotion or appointment to full professorship. These lectures are furthermore an ideal opportunity for new professors to introduce themselves and to present an overview of their own contribution to their field to academic peers, students, and research collaborators. Inaugural lectures are also a platform for celebrating a professor's academic achievements with his or her family, friends, mentors, and colleagues. Distinguished guests, it is my pleasure now to introduce the Dean and Head of the School of the Built Environment and Development Studies, Professor Nene Kalema, who will now formally introduce the inaugurant, Professor Catherine Sutherland.
Thank you, DVC. Welcome to you, colleagues, friends, and family. Professor Catherine Sutherland is a full professor in the School of Built Environment and Development Studies within the College of Humanities, University of KwaZulu-Natal. She is a geographer located within Development Studies cluster in the school. Professor Sutherland holds a PhD in Geography and Environmental Management from the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. She graduated cum laude with an MSc in Environmental and Geographical Science and a BSc Honors at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, having majored in Geography and Mathematics in her undergraduate degree. She joined the Geography Department at the University of Durban-Westville in 1995, moving from Cape Town to Durban for her first academic post, having previously taught geography and mathematics at Rodiposh Boys High School. In 1997, she joined the Geography and Environmental Science Department at the University of Natal and was part of the significant transformation of both universities through the early 2000s, which led the creation of the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Given the merger of the two institutions and her position as a geographer in both of them, she has in effect been teaching, conducting research, and engaging in social outreach in her academic position at the University of KwaZulu-Natal for a whopping 28 years. She is the academic leader of research and higher degrees in the School of Built Environment Development Studies, a research associate, lead social scientist in the School of Engineering Watch RD Center, and convener of the National Research Foundation Specialist Committee for NRF Rating, Anthropology, Development Studies, Geography, Sociology, and Social Work. This body oversees the benchmarking of South African researchers through national and international peer review. She is a board member of the Kennedy College and the chairperson of the College Transformation and Diversity Committees. She teaches postgraduate modules in environment, development, and research methods, and is privileged to collaborate with peers, academic peers, nationally and internationally. She leads global and national research programs funded by the national and international governments, donors, philanthropic institutions on sustainability and the value of ecological infrastructure, localizing global environmental change towards just and inclusive sustainability in South Africa. Professor Sutherland has worked in the area of informal settlement, upgrading and resilience, disaster risk reduction, innovation in water and sanitation technologies, gender intentionality in sanitation and innovation, and has worked also in social assessment of interventions to improve people and parks relations in the face of climate change and food security and environmental sustainability. The main focus of her research as a geographer is on society, space, and environment relations. She draws on the critical theoretical frameworks of political economy and political ecology using social constructivist and co-production methodologies to understand and develop transformative environmental governance in Durban. Her research is focused on City of Durban and more recently KwaZulu-Natal as a result of her engagement with ecosystem adaptation projects in the Isimangaliso and Utugela marine projects areas. In collaboration with her colleagues, Professor Diane Scott, Sibongile Buthelezi, Duduzile Kumalo, her research group, Patrick Martel, Anthony Odili, Bahle Mazeka, Fanele Magwaza, and the community she engages with, she has developed a significant body of work and methodologies on social assessments and co-production of knowledge, which has transformed relations between citizens and the state in Durban. She works closely with officials in a eThekwini municipality in the climate protection branch, the Sustainable and Resilient City Initiatives Unit, Catchment Management, Coastal Stormwater Department, eThekwini Water and Sanitation Unit, and Human Settlement Unit. What a handful. She works hard. Professor Sutherland has extensive experience in developing interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research across the 3 schools at UKZN through the disciplines of development studies, engineering, and environmental science, and with practitioner and policy communities, both at the local, traditional, provincial government, translating academia into action through her funded research projects. While research is locally focused on Durban, it has national and global reach, given the excellent laboratory of learning the city offers, with its socioeconomic and environmental challenges and opportunities, and its approach to innovation and experiential governance. Evidence of contribution to innovate and supportive teaching and learning has been her ability to build a research group of 10 community-based and young emerging academics who gain valuable experience working between science and society on her research projects that are changing policy and practice, particularly Durban's transformative ravine management program, just to name a few. But also she has also contributed in the Durban informal settlement and upgrading policy, global innovation, water and sanitation through engineering, field testing, disaster risk reduction, climate adaptation, and addressing people and parks conflict. She is the lead academic in the development of EPIC A program, a partnership program between UKZN, and the municipality. Her final year honor students register for full credit bearing module to conduct relevant research for eThekwini municipality. She has developed a teaching exchange with the University College of London, where students in a third year honors module from the north, from the University College of London, and the south, our university, UKZN, learn with and from each other through seminars designed to understand the value of nature. Professor Sutherland is a distinguished academic and NRF-rated researcher with a C2 rating. She has successfully completed the supervision of 2 doctoral students, 62 master students, and mentioned 4 postdoctoral and mentored 4 postdoctoral fellows. She is currently supervising 6 doctoral students and 12 master students. She has published 59 peer-reviewed journal articles, book chapters, and 2 books. She has been an external examiner for the University of Cape Town, University of Witwatersrand, and has examined doctoral and master theses from universities across South Africa, and has reviewed journal articles for a wide range of journals in geography, environmental management, sustainability, and urban studies. Professor Sutherland has been an invited speaker on a number of international conferences and workshops in the United Kingdom, Sweden, Netherlands, South Africa. She has been asked to teach on master's programs in the IEHE Delft, Netherlands, University of West England, Bristol, New York Institute of Technology in the US, Wageningen University in the Netherlands, and of course, the ET Zurich University in Switzerland. Ladies and gentlemen, friends and family, please join with us in congratulating Professor Sutherland and invite her to give her inaugural speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mkhize, and thank you for Professor Kalema for the very warm welcome. And thank you to all of those that are attending my inaugural lecture. So I'm just setting up the slides here. I hope that everybody can see the presentation. So to start off with, I'd just like to reflect on the fact that what I'm going to speak to you about today and all of the work that I've been doing is certainly not my work alone. So I'm very grateful to my university, the University of Cape Town, and to Belinda Dodson and Mil Soman, who supervised me through my master's, to the University of KwaZulu-Natal, the most incredible university that's been my home for 28 years. I've been through some pretty challenging times in this university, but I've always been incredibly proud and incredibly grateful for the opportunities the university has given me. And then to all those that have contributed to the knowledge that I present today, to the communities on the ground who have taught me so much. So much of what I know comes from the amazing people that live and produce life within our cities within South Africa, and they've been my greatest teachers. To eThekwini municipality, and officials within the municipality that are partners of mine, and who collectively we have worked together to focus on urban reform coalitions and building sustainability in the city. And then to this word cloud that just represents the many scholars, both young emerging scholars and very academics that I've spent many years working together with, that have really shaped my ideas and helped me move to where I am. And then also to the collaborators that I've had internationally, where we have debated issues around the global north and the global south, and how we see the world and how we see sustainability, and questioning whether there are as such significant differences as we often think between the north and south. And then especially to my family for the incredible support and they have given me, and they are such an inspiration to me, and they've enabled me, while being their mother and their wife and their daughter and their sister, to be able to participate in academic life in the way I have. And then most especially to my most incredible mentor, who I miss so terribly much, and sorry to get emotional at this point, but Professor Diane Scott, who is part of every single word that I will be speaking today. She and I conducted research together for 27 years, until very sadly we lost her suddenly last year, but she's always with me in my thoughts and in my work. So as Professor Kalema alluded to, my main theoretical framework or my point of departure is always geography and looking at society, space, and environment relations. And I'm always inspired by the spatial turn, the interpretive turn of social constructivism and knowledge production, the moral turn introduced to me by David Smith of a good society, and of course the other than human turn or the environmental turn that so strongly influences my work. I'm very interested in the geographical and historical causes of inequality and injustice and what might be done about that, drawing on political economy and political ecology, society and economy, society and environment, to determine who gets what, where, how, and why, and how context and histories and geographies and structure and agency influence the life in the city. I've also been influenced by Jenny Robinson's work on comparative urbanism and the idea of the ordinary city, that the challenges that we face in cities might run through all cities after all, and I'll return to this in the last slide of my presentation. And then more recently to Diana Mitlin, who I believe has had a similar long journey of working on the same kinds of issues right through her academic life, and has introduced me to the kind of framework of urban reform coalitions, which I'd like to introduce as my new perspective on the work that I've been doing for many years. And then to my city, our city, Durban, the most incredible city to be an academic in because it offers so much in terms of learning as an African city with its different settlement areas, its different forms of infrastructure, and its incredible environmental asset base that Patrick Martel and I decided to call the first layer of the spatial development framework of the city. Because Durban is a city of rivers, it's a city of nature, it's a city of the built environment and of people. And this city has enabled me to learn and understand so much. And so this is the lens through which I look at all of my work. And while this is very localized, I believe the city has much to teach the global world. And of course, the spaces that I work mainly in, the informal settlements of our city that make up 25% of the city, the low-cost housing projects that house 18% of our population, and then the peri-urban or traditional authority areas that are so interesting and so dynamic and are 43% of the municipal areas. So these are the spaces that have taught me so much. So how have I come to the emergence of urban reform coalitions in Durban? Well, through my research and practice on urban and environmental governance over 28 years, through looking at the challenges we face, the lessons we've learned, the collaboration, diversification, innovation, and in fact the hybridity, which I know some decolonial scholars will question whether hybridity is not a colonial construct. But I believe in our African context, the idea of hybridity or different systems, different ways of knowing coming together to produce new spaces is very important, and it helps to inform our work on urban reform coalitions. And so what are these coalitions? Well, Mitlin defines them as a group of diverse stakeholders, civil society, state agencies, private enterprises, which we don't really engage that much with, but we're learning from some instances in our city, and research institutions who see benefits in coming together for varying lengths of time and co-producing knowledge to achieve common goals, social, economic, and environmental goals. And in these urban reform coalitions, we seek flexibility to reduce the hierarchical, managerial, and technocratic relations that have been so common between the state and its citizens. And I'm very interested in the role of intermediaries, and I believe my research group plays a critical role in understanding what intermediaries can do to try and build these relationships between state and citizens, so that we can create new forms of urban governance, new kinds of configurations that Di Scott always spoke about, that are historically and geographically contextualized to address social and environmental justice. And when we look at governance, we don't just look at governance beyond the state, as Swinkudo cautioned us, but in our case, and you'll see very strongly in my work, I'm a strong believer in the state and the believer in local government. And so my governance includes the state and building state-citizen relations. So we need to advance our understanding, perhaps, of how these urban reform coalitions form and how they function effectively so we can achieve transformative sustainability. So in order to do that, I'd like to take you through a journey of my work over the past 28 years, of the critical moments of transformation and learning that I've seen through my engaged research, and to draw on the concepts, the threads, the understanding, and the evidence that myself and the large group of people that I work with have built to support my argument today that urban reform coalitions matter for transformative sustainability. And so I go back to the work on ecological modernization and sustainability through a research project funded by the NRF. And I'm also most grateful to the NRF for the long periods of research funding I've received from them, of environmental decision-making in South Africa that Di Scott led. That was an 8-year research program. It gave us a lot of time to understand what we were looking at, and started in the early 2000s. And Di Scott had gone to Cambridge and come back on from her sabbatical with this idea of ecological modernization, which is a very scientific, technical, and modernist approach to managing the environment. And Di and I and Shirley Brooks and Jennifer Houghton started to look at these ideas and to think that, in fact, ecological modernization through environmental impact assessment, that was actually driven largely by my university where I studied, the University of Cape Town, was really dominant in the field of environmental management. And we wanted to democratize this form of environmental decision-making. We wanted to juxtapose it and integrate it with the multiple knowledges and diverse and contested discourses of other actors to try and create more sustainable development in our cities. And so we worked initially within the role of environmental impact assessment by conducting social impact assessments on environmental management and planning. And we were fortunate in the years from 2000 to 2015 to work on many of the mega projects or large-scale projects in Durban. And so what Di and I did is we worked through these formal statutory procedures to try and include the voices and everyday lived worlds of ordinary people in the decision-making in our cities. We were engaged in this ongoing project of deepening democracy to support the rights-based post-apartheid discourse, because we knew the country required a confident, informed, and politicized citizenry to bring in these alternative views to expert-driven, state-centered democracy. And so we worked hard on developing new methodologies for social assessment, which we continue to do, and to ensure that the rights and needs of the marginalized, those invisible stakeholders, were taken into account in decision-making in our city. And so we were so fortunate to engage in the city's dominant development discourse at the time, that of Durban being a mega project city, and to work on this range of mega projects to try and bring these new sets of voices into the way the city was evolving. And one of those projects was the Small Craft Harbour that was developed. And here you can see in the bottom image, this is the kind of new image of what's going to happen to Durban's beachfront. But when Di and I were working on it, the proposed EIA was around this very elitist, neoliberal, globalized view of a waterfront development that was going to take large areas of this very precious, safe space within Durban's beachfront and ocean and turn it over to an elite enclosed or small craft harbor with very limited access to ordinary people. So we mapped the lives and activities of ordinary people and called this a magical performance space and created a voice for all those that use this very important space in our city. And through that SIA, we were able to overturn the politically influenced environmental impact assessment that had been approved through political decisions, even though the Department of Environment and Tourist Affairs had turned it down. And it was overturned in the High Court through the Agency of Citizens. So they had used the modality of social mobilization, these legislative procedures, and used our SIA to overturn a decision that was going to take a public space away from the people of Durban. And we felt through this that we'd advanced the democratic project. We were then very lucky to work on a large project called Chance to Sustain from 2010 to 2015, funded by the EU. And this was really interesting because it supported our interest in comparative urbanism. And here what we were able to do was to look at the countries of India, South Africa, Brazil, and Peru. And again, you can see the theme in our work. Look at how governments and citizens, so state-citizen relations in building sustainability in cities through participatory spatial knowledge management. So to try and direct urban governance through new forms of spatial planning, but spatial planning that was participatory. And again, this project focused on mega projects. It focused on substandard human settlements, on water governance, and on knowledge systems. And I have to say that this project created a fantastic platform from which I've been able to build the rest of my research work going forward. So just to say to young emerging scholars, try and get one big project that you can build a platform on, and from that you can develop so many of the ideas that you're interested in. And it was in this work that we started to do engagement with communities and to get them on the map. So this was an informal community we worked in for over 7 years. And we worked with these participatory methodologies to get the community to draw their settlement. As you'll know, the city has maps for spatial development frameworks, but the way that informal settlements are mapped are always at the neighborhood scale. And we wanted to map every single individual household so that each person could claim their right to the city. And we transferred those community-based maps into digital maps, into participatory GIS. And when we took them to the communities, this image that I show you here is one of my most exciting days in my research, because I took the GIS map where everyone could see that they were now recorded on the GIS map of the city, and the excitement and the joy at this community of saying, we are now put on the map, we are now made visible, because councillors had come to this community in times when they were protesting for services, for rights, for right to belong to the city, and always focused on this community and said, don't do this protesting, don't do this, because remember, you are not on the map. And so this put them on this map. That put them on the map. It made them known to the city. And so through this project, I continued to work on informal settlements and understanding the relationships of society, space, and environment in these kinds of precarious situations, and then to follow these groups of people into the low-cost housing projects or the public infrastructure that the state had provided to house them. And I began to understand about the relations between this form of agency where the poor create spaces for themselves and what happens to their lives and the way in which they can participate in the urban fabric when they get moved into the kind of modernist, low-cost housing projects that are so familiar in our cities. And while we saw great benefits of communities getting access to safer housing, to urban services, to roads, to infrastructure, we also saw the losses and costs when their voices were not taken into account or included in the planning of these housing projects. And so I learned so much from them in terms of understanding this relationship between informality and formality and building the city, and how do we build the city, for whom and by whom, and what do we do when we want to engage with the urban poor in finding solutions to their future. Do we just reproduce these centralized projects, or do we actually find other ways of doing this? And that also takes me to another area that we've worked on with Sibongeli and Dudu and Vicky Sim. And Vicky did an enormous amount of work for us, trying to understand another space in our city that's so full of hybridity, a space where the city is being built from below. And that's in 43% of the land area of our city, the traditional authority areas, where you have the dual governance system of the traditional authority allocating land, the most precious resource in our country. Well, water and land, I would say, are the two most precious resources we have. But how the allocation of land defines what the municipality can do in terms of its service provision. And so we started to explore these different planning and development systems and started to think about, again, this notion of hybridity of two very different systems of governance coming together across 43% of our land area and our municipality, and how that created a future that was inclusive, that enabled the provision of services, and that enabled a good life, that good society for communities living here. And that took us to the idea of how do you deal with sanitation and water? Because of course, these peri-urban areas that I was working in are outside of the extent of the sewerage or infrastructure system of the city. And that's because of the municipal demarcation process in the year 2000. So how do we deliver safe water and sanitation systems when the pipes, the infrastructure, the means by which we do it, the centralized systems, don't reach to those edges of the city? What do we do when we develop sanitation where the sewers don't go? And how does that inform or change the relationships between citizens and the state? And so through the influence of Chris Buckley and the WASH R&D Centre too, we started to explore these different sanitation systems and how we could deal with water and sanitation. And we started to understand that what the state was doing at this period of time in the city from 1994 to 2015, I would say about, was that it was delivering. Durban was very successful initially in delivering low-cost housing, this sort of modernist project of delivery of free basic housing. And at the same time was delivering centralized infrastructure of communal ablution blocks that were linked to the sewers to provide water and sanitation in informal settlements, and urine diversion toilets and ground tanks to 88,000 citizens living in the periphery of our city. And we started to think about this centralized way of providing a universal set of basic services to all. And we wrote about the spatially differentiated service provision model that is so prevalent in our city, and how that raised inequality, but also led to people getting a basic level of service. And then we were so interested in engaging in the communities that experienced this rollout of services. And we saw how communities themselves adapted what the city provided for them and created their own living spaces, such as this little gated estate within the Ocean Drive and informal settlement, where this small section of the community had gated themselves off and produced their own form of service provision that raised their quality of life and adapted the toilets the state provided for them and made them more livable and more acceptable in terms of what they needed. And I saw that too in the informal settlements I work in, just post the 2019 floods, how the citizens engaged with the promises of the state. And this is a house that was built by a man who lost both his land and house in the flood. And the flood happened 4 days after the national elections. And I was walking through the community looking at the response of the informal settlers alone to reproduce or to create a life for themselves again in the city. And I saw a man that took the promises of the elections, the promises of each electoral party, the DA, the EFF, the ANC, and he took those posters and he built his house himself with the promises that they had on those posters. So when you start to engage with how the state draws on what the state, how citizens draw on what the state promises, what it gives, how they adapt and change that, you start to understand perhaps how we can create an inclusive city. And then to my next great moment that was provided to me through an opportunity, again from the NRF, but with a Norwegian partnership, where at the end of the Chance to Sustain project, I'd started to see the work of Deborah Roberts and Neil McLeod converging. There was a convergence around water and climate governance and a focus on this community-based ecosystem adaptation. And so when I got this funding, I started to think about what the state was doing to try and address these issues and engaged with the Umgeni Ecological Infrastructure Partnership that Graham Jewett had been working on, where we were looking at how we could use ecological infrastructure to try and support the state and citizens in creating a more sustainable life for all. And so I started to look at these state-citizen relationships and saw that at a regional level and at a local government level, the city was focusing on river rehabilitation projects. And so I approached eThekwini Water and Sanitation and EPCPD, the climate protection branch, and Sean O'Donoghue very strongly came forward and said, yes, he also wanted to engage in this innovative and creative kind of work. And with the support of Deborah and Joe Dials, we were able to create an idea about ecosystem-based adaptation and trying to produce a form of catchment rehabilitation that would address the sustainability issues in the city. And so began a very long partnership that started in 2013 and still going on now, of the Palmy Catchment Rehabilitation Project, on which so much of my work focuses. And what was interesting here, and again, this was also through the influence of Graham Jewett, we were focusing on how we could make the biosphere the base asset of all the things that we did. So we really recognized, and with Patrick Martel and we argued that, as I said, the spatial development framework of the city should really be premised on its ecological infrastructure and on its rivers, because Durban has so much biodiversity and so much to offer through the natural environment. And this biodiversity and ecosystem services, which is so abundant but under huge pressure, these ecosystem factories of our city are so important where engineered infrastructure is not available and where environmental change has the most significant impacts on the vulnerable and the poor. And so we started to work on these river rehabilitation projects, and this led us into what has now more recently been called Durban's Transformative Riverine Management Program, which was launched a couple of years ago. And so these river rehabilitation projects for us reveal a more open and co-produced form of planning and water management, which includes the knowledge and practices of multiple actors, or what we like to call catchment planners, both from within and outside of the state. We believe that rivers and their catchments are the spatial expression of sustainability that is contextual, collaborative, inclusive, and about partnerships. And so we look at ecological, hydrological, social, economic, environmental, and political relationships across the catchment. And we've done this through building these governance platforms. And the city, and through the work of Nikki and Miles Mander, has done a business case for this transformative riverine management program. And you can see that for every R1 a city spends, there's up to R3.40 of benefits and societal benefits for engaging in transformative riverine management. And so this is a program that we're all still actively supporting and working on. So how did we build that governance platform? Well, we started right in the beginning, and it's thanks to Vicky Sim, who went out and tried to understand all of the actors working in the catchment. And you can see from this diagram that we've built a governance platform that I'm proud to say, 10 years later, even though it's a voluntary platform of people working within the Palmy catchment, and while there's been a lot of conflict within this group of actors at times, is still going strong. We had our last meeting last Tuesday, and all of my EPIC A students joined me in that and saw the work of this program. And so the key actors here are eThekwini municipality, particularly the climate protection branch with Sean and Simiso, stormwater catchment management with Jeff Tooley, and then the housing departments come in through UKZN, ourselves as researchers, the Quarry Road West Informal Settlement Community, environmental groups, and other NGOs and NPOs that come our way as we work on these projects. We also have support at times from national government, regional governance bodies, and global institutions. But this is the governance platform that we've built, which now I think I'm starting to call an urban reform coalition. And so our work from my research team has largely been in the most vulnerable space in this catchment, and that's in the Quarry Road West Informal Settlement. And this is one of the participatory GIS maps that we worked on. Bashle Mazeka produced this with me, where we got the community to actually map the risks and hazards. And you can see that most of this community actually is located within the 1 in 100 year floodplain, but not where the community first started. That space there is where Mamsutu first settled, and you can see how wise she was in choosing the location of the settlement. And so we've worked with a group of community-based researchers over 10 years, doing all kinds of research and engagement, and all of it driven by the needs from what they need in their informal settlement. We've done participatory mapping, as I said. We've mapped this whole settlement too. They were part of Durban's resilience strategy. They have done risk mapping and climate adaptation in a climate smart informal settlement handbook. We've looked at their notions of home as informal settlers living in the city. How do they see the conception of home? And I'll show you a slide on that. We've tested innovative sanitation technologies in the settlement, and they've been part of Durban's informal settlement upgrading project, UKZN, which has led to a really progressive and the first case of an informal settlement upgrading policy in a city in South Africa. We've looked at their role of enviro-champs as they've worked across this catchment to try and change relationships between society and nature. And we focused on a community-based flood warning system, which I'll speak to you at the end of my presentation. So this is just what we've also tried to do in our work, is to try and look at what infrastructure means when we talk about development in our cities. And this comes from the narratives of home. And here you can see what this research has shown us when we talk about infrastructure. It's called rest and rock. When we came here to build our shack, this rock was there. We spend our time with our friends under the tree, and my mom sits on the rock with her cup of tea every morning. Whenever my mom is not around, we sit there because we miss her. It's a special rock. It makes me feel at home. And so through this work, we've been able to identify what matters to people as they create home in spaces of such vulnerability and precarity. And we've tried to build different kinds of relationships, state-citizen relationships, university-citizen relations. And this photo here with Simiso is one of my most exciting moments, because when we first started to work in this community, the municipality was actually chased out with sticks and stones. We had to go in with armed bodyguards, undercover guards to approach this community, which changed very quickly once we started working with them. But this is an amazing image of changing positions, because here are community members in municipality uniforms doing a river cleanup. And so we began to see our relationship with each other and how we could change our positions through the ways in which we inclusively are trying to rebuild our city. And in those informal settlements, we don't just go there to see them being researched in their space, to go and do our work in their places. We bring these informal community members to our university where they come to our research space. They come and research within our space and understand us. And so we try and shift the power dynamics of knowledge production to recognize that multiple knowledges count in the building of sustainable cities. And then to another huge part of my work of innovation in non-sewage sanitation and water services. And this was led by Professor Chris Buckley, also a hugely influential person in my life, and through the WASH R&D Center with Sue Mercer and Kerry Fulp. And in this work on innovation and non-sewage sanitation, we've conducted all the social assessment work that is being conducted in our city. And amazingly, Durban is the field testing site for all the global technologies for water and sanitation in the world. So our amazing city is where these technologies for reinventing the toilet are going to be located. And so in this work on the innovation of non-sewage sanitation, again, as we tested these new toilets, because we recognize the urine diversion toilets have reached their shelf life, The communal ablution blocks are too expensive and too difficult for the city to sustain. How do we create new forms of sanitation that are environmentally sustainable, socially just, and inclusive? And so the whole approach that we adopted here is through this, again, making the community the center of the testing. And so in this knowledge exchange diagram, you will see, and this is where we were testing this amazing water wall from Inaugural in Switzerland. And in fact, 2 weeks ago, I was at Inaugural actually looking at the images of this community. So I saw community members from Durban on the walls of the Inaugural building in Zurich in Switzerland. And I was so proud of these community members and what they had contributed to innovation in this hand washing station. And here you can see all of those that worked to test this technology in an informal settlement. We trained up community members who did the research with us, with our students, with the 2 engineers from Inaugural, and with members of eThekwini Municipality Water and Sanitation Unit. And collectively, we worked to understand whether this technology was appropriate for this informal settlement. So you can see that the community, through our engineering field testing platform, is at the center of our testing of these technologies. And they provide such valuable input. They had tested the same technology in a park in Zurich. And you know that no citizens asked questions about how this technology worked. If the water was safe, would it switch off when it was not working properly because it's got a biotechnology to clean the water? What happened if blood went into the system? Would that still be safe to use? And yet all of those questions came up from the community members as they started to engage with this system. And so the learnings from Durban have influenced sanitation and technology development globally. And so what we've started to realize through all of this work is that, in fact, what we need in the city, and this is another theme of my presentation, that we're moving away from large-scale centralized systems. And while the engineers in the room might have great concerns about what I'm saying, is I'm not saying we're getting rid of centralized, modernist, large-scale systems, but they alone cannot meet the needs of our growing populations and of people both in the global south and the global north. And so what we are doing is we're finding alternatives to shore up, to add to the already provided systems that we have in our cities. And here you can see a communal ablution block in an informal settlement where we are testing the Kalula toilet, which is a dried, non-sewage sanitation technology that's actually paid for sanitation. So again, we're breaking from the patterns of the past, we're breaking the path dependencies and trying to see if we can have affordable, paid for sanitation that supports the infrastructure that's provided by the state. And so to sum up in what I've got to so far, before we look at what this means in terms of urban reform coalitions, I think this diagram that I created, and with help from Patrick Martel, sort of sums up the kind of focus of our work, that we are looking at how we do sustainable urban development as a continuum of built infrastructure, built and ecological infrastructure, social and ecological infrastructure, all working together at different times and across different scales to address the problems that we face in our city. We're working through different institutions, some of which are formal and others informal, to try and understand how we do this best. And our governance models firmly in the bottom part of this diagram, where it's collaborative efforts by local actors and multi-level interactions of multiple actors to try and find solutions to problems in our cities. And we're looking at the costs and benefits, not only from a financial point of view, but in our work through the social assessment on who benefits and who loses. And we have to do this, and we have to understand this in context. And sometimes the context is at the really localized scale, and sometimes it's at the city scale. And what we looked at, and this trialectic idea comes from our PhD thesis, is that we look at the relations between society, space, and in this case, it's water, and what structural elements define what we can and can't do. And so if we look at the society space axis, I would think of things like the fact that we're a colonial, post-colonial and post-apartheid city, or that our city has 43% of its area under traditional governance and therefore is a dual governance city. If I looked at water and society relationships, I'd looked at the spiritual value of nature, the value of water to people, and how it's differently constructed in different kinds of environments and what that means to the solutions we find. And if I looked across at water and space, what are the structural elements there? Well, it might be how our spatial forms, particularly the spatial engineering of apartheid that's so strongly constrained, how water gets to and is accessed by different people in our city. And so this trialectic enables us to understand context and make wiser solutions. And so now to the idea of urban reform coalitions, to the ideas that have come from working with Diana Mitlin and her team at Manchester University. And what's interesting is that we've always been talking about these as governance platforms, actually. So we talk, and Patrick and Bashle and Sibongile Madudu, myself, Fanele, Anthony, we've spoken about the kind of governance arenas that we're creating in the city. But in fact, I think Diana's conceptualization of an urban reform coalition is really powerful and very fitting. And that's what we're trying to think about as we advance this work. And so you would have seen that I've spoken about the Palmy Catchment Rehabilitation Project as one such urban reform coalition, with its informal network, its action plan that addresses very specific things in that catchment, and its state, university, civil society, citizens relationship coming through multiple funding sources, mainly my third stream funding from the university that I have. And then the engineering field testing platform for innovation in sanitation, which is a more formal partnership, but an equally innovative EFT platform that's been developed within the WASH R&D Center at UKZN that I'm extremely proud of. And here, global tech developers, the state, university, and citizens have worked collectively together over 6 or 7 years to try and advance the development of safe and accessible sanitation for all. And then the UKZN Informal Settlement Upgrading Program, which is again a formal program of a state, NPO, university, and citizen-led program to try and bring an informal settlement upgrading policy into the municipality to guide how we upgrade informal settlements in our city. And it's so interesting because when I was teaching my students over the last few weeks, they're quite determined to point out to me that the way in which we're working is actually supporting informality in the city, and is that always the wisest thing to do? And so they were raising questions about how we progressively supported informal settlements, and were we not raising a discourse that this kind of informality is now acceptable in cities? And I said to them, it's never acceptable for somebody to live in an informal settlement. But in the conditions that we live in and with the kinds of challenges we face, that is the reality for so many people. And so we need to rise up and do something to upgrade these settlements for communities in our city. And then I've been thinking most recently about whether the way in which we responded to the 100 Resilient Cities program was not in itself another form of urban reform coalition. Because what Deborah Roberts, Joe Dawes, and Manisha Magnalal did with their partnership with the university and other key thinkers in the city was to build an argument for urban resilience that was strongly rooted and grounded in the everyday lived worlds of citizens of Durban. And what we did is we responded back to this global movement, this global project of urban resilience that had been defined in the offices of New York and sent out to the cities of the global south and elsewhere. And through the work, by engaging with citizens, we were able to build a strong argument about why we wanted to construct our resilience strategy in the way that we did. And so I think what Deborah and Joe and Manisha did with support from others was really to build an urban reform coalition that spoke back to a global project that was dominating the views of what urban resilience meant across the world. And so that was also, I think, another example of this. So if we look at the analysis of urban reform coalitions, what does that mean to us? And I think the first point is that the developmental state cannot address urban challenges alone. The mandate that was given to the state in 1994 was almost an impossible mandate. We're working on a project for payment for water services, and you can just see the way in which it was impossible for the state to continue on that project. And in fact, it's a miracle that it's actually lasted for 30 years. So how do we support the state? And what Mark Kaline has so interestingly said in our NRF 3-day workshop we've just recently held, that what we have to do is build systems that shore up the state, that support the state. As we've seen in our flood response work, the state cannot respond fast enough on its own. It cannot respond quickly when disasters happen. So how do we build these urban reform coalitions so that we can step into the spaces? Because as what I'm arguing is that urban reform coalitions always arise when there are institutional voids. They are there when there are spaces of opportunity. Context matters, and so urban reform coalitions understand the reality on the ground in particular places. And they draw on the co-production of knowledge, of specialists, of experts, because remember, experts live on the ground too. So the specialists might be the scientists, but there are experts right across our society, and on experiential knowledge to build the best solutions that we can find for problems that we face. And urban reform coalitions enable innovation at the local scale to address inequality and challenges. They require the commitment, and that's what we need in our society, the building of social cohesion and commitment of citizens, of municipal officials, of NGOs and consultants and researchers, and I hope soon the private sector too, to undertake this participatory and experimental governance and using transdisciplinary researcher processes to address urban challenges. But to do that, we need trusted and committed relationships. And where we are so lucky in Durban is that we have such porous boundaries between the local municipality and the university. We are so fortunate because we just work so easily together without formal contracts and without all the kind of bureaucratic bunglings that would stop us working on innovation. We work between each other's offices. We work in the same shared spaces with the citizens that we serve. And so as our role as a university, we have to play this intermediary role to build these relationships across these different actor groups for the sustainable development of our cities. And as Diana Mitlin says, these coalitions may be partially formal with some kind of organizational base, but whatever way that they organize, they're always going to include informal activities and relations. And that's where Africa and the Global South has so much to offer, because we are so good at working through informal activities and relations. And we also need to use urban reform coalitions because there's definitely a need for decentralization, as the large-scale centralized systems that we've developed globally and that we locked into with these path dependencies no longer can provide services for everyone. And so urban reform coalitions are ideal for managing this decentralization that we have to see. And the actors within these coalitions act through negotiation. They frame problems at different levels. They find different kinds of solutions. And the challenge is that when we do that and we show this innovation, we can get stuck in these coalitions because we need resource allocation and we need practices and material outcomes to find real solutions on the ground. And that's why I'm such a firm believer in the state, because that's when the state can act. It doesn't have to do everything. Urban reform coalitions can do a whole lot of the work, but then the state has to deliver on mandates for regulated material and instrumental transformation to take place. That is the responsibility of the state. That's what its resources should be used for. And so we can think about how urban reform coalitions can support the state in delivering on its mandates towards sustainability. And of course, what's exciting about these coalitions is they always represent counter moves in some form or another. And so they bring new ways of looking at the same problem. They usually draw on a core set of actors. Some come and go, they change over time, but the core set of actors remain. And one of the challenges that we have with them, which Diana Mitlin's also raised, is that when you get non-state actors acting outside of the state and moving their negotiations away from the transparent and accountable systems of modern government, like we see with the Westville ratepayers pulling away from the state and refusing to pay their rates. I'm not a fan of that kind of approach, because I think when actors start moving away from the state, then we start to see all kinds of challenges arising. And that goes to what we mean by the polity or the democratization of society. What Plato and Archimedes were kind of criticizing with their views of expert-driven knowledge. We've got to be careful of governance beyond the state. We need the state to manage and to regulate and to be transparent about how development goes forward, but we can shore up the state, as Mark Kalina said. And so I believe we need these different skills, knowledges, each knowing what we can do, what we can bring, and each group getting on with and doing the work. There's always going to be contestation, but collectively we can make changes. So I've argued with you that urban coalitions matter because they bring hope, but how do we ensure they bring changes on the ground? How does this act of governing build relationships, social cohesion, capacity and knowledge? But how do we see real solutions? And I want you to refer to one example that we've just seen recently through our work, where urban coalitions, an urban reform coalition really delivered change on the ground. And this is in our community-based flood early warning system that we developed slowly but surely from 2016, as we started to see the risk of flooding for the Quarry Road informal settlement at the bottom of the Palmead River. And the Palmead River on most days looks like a small stream, but when it rains hard, because of the catchments, it's a raging, roaring river that is extremely dangerous and can cause destruction within an hour of heavy rain falling in the upper parts of the catchment. And so what we did is we took the technical knowledge of early flood warning systems and we integrated it with the social component of warnings and dissemination and communication and preparedness to respond. And fortunately, that worked when we had the dramatic floods that we had in Durban in 2022. And so this flood warning system is based on a strong partnership with Jeff Tooley and his work in the Catchment Management Department through his flood early warning system that's based on science and technology, through his Fuse system that models and collects data and records it and sends it through systems that provide us with the kind of knowledge we know. And so he uses hydrographs and radars and the rain gauges. And you can see this is the information Jeff was sending us over the floods on the 11th of April in 2022. And you can see the Palmeet River reached the level of 3 meters, which you can imagine is extremely dangerous when you're living in that floodplain as a Quarry Road West informal resident. And so through our very interesting and innovative WhatsApp group system, using the South African Weather Service information and using 2 different WhatsApp groups that include the communities, the knowledge from the Fuse system, and linking into disaster management in the city, we are able to support each other and warn each other of impending floods and damages in the city. And here you can see the cell phone messages we were sending to each other on WhatsApp on that fateful day of the 11th of April 2022. And you can see we already had started sending messages out. Jeff had sent the first message on the Sunday, the day before. And Samiso went down to Quarry Road to check. And then Samiso, Sean, and Jeff gave me the courage to go down to the settlement late in the afternoon too, because I had enough information from them to know that I was safe to go there. And we started to work with the community to warn them that the river was going to rise very quickly and very suddenly, and that there were still 3 more storm cells to come. And here you can see the messages we were passing between us at 9 and 10 o'clock at night, when Nono was sending us from Quarry Road images of the river breaking its banks and actually changing course and rushing into the front of the settlement. And so we were able to identify very quickly safe spaces where the citizens could go to try and get safe shelter from a river that was roaring through the front of their settlement. And we were dealing with this while we actually had load shedding at the same time. And so in this work, what we were doing was trying to address the issue of floods coming through the settlement. And here you can see the drone maps and the images of that settlement in July 2019. And here you can see where the river changed course and went right across the road, moved containers, and washed out 60 households, which amounted to about 300 people. And so this early flood warning system saved the lives on that fateful night of all those people because we had developed this flood warning system. And so what's the importance of that in terms of urban reform coalitions? Well, the simple system that we've developed through this coalition that we've had tells us a whole lot of things. And one, that it saved the lives on that night, and it's something we're going to scale up across the city. But more importantly, what it's taught us is that when everybody in a system understands what they have to do and what knowledge they can bring, when we all know how we're building towards some kind of a sustainable future, we can achieve the amazing things that we saw on that night. And so to finish off, I wanted to think firstly about the role of academia in reform coalitions. And so I wanted to talk about how as researchers, we embedded in urban reform coalitions. We hold a privileged position as researchers working on these processes, and we need to exercise the power we have very wisely as intermediaries. We have to shift discourses to ensure that different knowledges are respected and taken up through reframing, to deal with the gatekeepers, to address conflict, to create safe spaces of learning, and to be empathetic. Through co-producing knowledge with marginalized communities as a research process, it enables us and enables communities to frame their challenges as research questions. We can help them produce knowledge through methodologies which reflect their reality and their needs, and which can speak to science and policy. We can look at different knowledges that matter over space and time, because as researchers, we read the context and the landscape. We're interested in the connections, and we can shape and know how knowledge moves and where it should move and when and where. And we can create analytical frameworks like Diana Mitlin's done, which gives us knowledge both a home and power. And we need to think of the risk of our own positionality, our own agenda, of staying on the road and going the distance, and of continuing to obtain funding, and of not ever breaking trust, and to be aware of our own agency in this work. And so when I was traveling overseas just recently, I started to think about the positionality of the Global South. And I want to end with this slide because this is my sort of new set of ideas, where I started to ask questions. We were working on water security and treatment of wastewater. And I was working in societies like Sweden and Switzerland, and started to ask people about how they deal with water governance. What are their risks and concerns about water and sanitation and infrastructure and the delivery of these services? And in most instances, they have such trust in the state that infrastructure is so hidden that they're not really aware of those processes that happen. And yet, if you work in Durban, everybody knows the risk to water. Everybody knows about water security and water scarcity. Everybody knows about how to manage water services and how precarious and how valuable they are. And yet, when I was in the global north, this just wasn't really apparent, even to the researchers that I was working with on water governance. And so I started to think about how we construct the ideas of development. And I went back to the good old Rothschild's model of development, where all cities or all places are supposed to follow the global north, to move up this ladder and to get to the position of high mass consumption. And I started to think about our cities in the global south, and my city.
Prof. Sutherland, we are unable to hear you. Professor Mkhize. Prof. Hello, Prof. We seem to have lost Professor Sutherland. I've just checked and I think she's been cut off this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Adams. I think under the circumstances, we may have to proceed with the vote of thanks. If you are agreeable to that, the professor was drawing towards the conclusion of her lecture, and I think you will all agree that it was an inspirational lecture from the heart indeed. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to come back to the podium to deliver this vote of thanks. In my view, Professor Sutherland's lecture has demonstrated the role that can be played by the university and higher education institutions towards the upliftment of communities and society in general. It is a clear demonstration of the relationship that we can have not only with the city, but our surrounding communities, all of whom are involved in the co-production of knowledge from different epistemological vantage positions. The embeddedness of Professor Sutherland's work within the city of eThekwini in general reaffirms our vision to be the premier university of African scholarship. It also resonates with our approach as an institution to community engagement that is informed by research and the scholarship of teaching and learning. In recognizing your community-based partners, researchers and co-collaborators, students and fellow researchers and peers, all of whom have been a part of your journey, Professor Sutherland, you are also reaffirming another key maxim in African philosophy, the maxim that umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu, that you cannot become what you ought to be unless all of us can realize our ambitions together. So your lecture, from where I'm standing, is firmly embedded within the vision and mission of the University of KwaZulu-Natal to be the university, to be the premier university of African scholarship. We, as the College of Humanities and the university in general, are very proud and honored to have Professor Sutherland as a member of our academic community. We also want to thank her for the leadership that she is providing, not only at college level, but the university as a whole, as well as within the city of eThekwini and our country in general. Ladies and gentlemen, it is important for me to recognize that today's lecture has been attended by several delegates, several community representatives from the province, the country, and internationally beyond our borders. We cannot mention all of them because there are just too many. We thank you all for celebrating Professor Sutherland's successes with us. I would also like to thank your family, Professor Sutherland, your colleagues in the School of the Built Environment and Development Studies, and all your mentors, locally and internationally, as well as the city of eThekwini and the surrounding communities that continue to support you, the school, and the community. To all of you attending Professor Sutherland's lecture today, thank you for coming to co-celebrate with us. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to highlight that this lecture will not have been possible without the sterling professional support that we always receive from the Office of the Registrar, Dr. Kathy Cleland, and your team. Thank you very much for the support that you always give us. And also, I want to extend our appreciation to Ms. Norma Zondo and her entire division, the Division of Corporate Relations, because once more, they've succeeded in assisting the college to deliver yet another exemplary lecture by all standards. With those words, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to thank you all for attending today's lecture, and may you all go in peace and have a wonderful afternoon. I thank you all.